Hey, it's Ye for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to wind a hank of yarn into a center pole cake of yarn very quickly with a yarn winder and Swift. So if you have ever purchased yarn that comes like this, where it's not in a skein where you can just find the end of it and start working with the yarn, this is called a hank of yarn. Sometimes it's also called a skein, but other ways that yarn is sold are also called skeins at times too. So this is what is normally called a hank of yarn, and this one in particular is Hawthorne Fingering in the Contessa colorway from Knit Picks or We Crochet, either one. And I'm going to demonstrate how we're going to wind yarn on a yarn winder and Swift with this yarn. Now, this type of put up, or this is how the yarn comes as far as in a hank. It's basically a big loop of yarn that has been twisted over itself into this shape. So before we can work with this, we have to wind it into some other kind of skein or ball or something before we can actually knit or crochet with it. So you can go one route, which is to lay the untwisted hank over something like a chair or whatever, and then wind a ball of yarn by hand. But that takes quite a while. That is rather time consuming. And if you're only going to be winding this type of yarn into a ball every rare once in a while, then that might work okay for you. But if you're going to be using yarn that comes in a hank like this more often, I highly recommend getting a yarn winder and Swift. Now, they don't have to be very expensive. I'm going to show you two different options that I have right here, but they don't have to be crazy expensive. You can get an inexpensive yarn winder and an inexpensive Swift if you're going to be doing this every now and then, but not like all the time. And then there's also a slightly more expensive, higher quality version that you can get if you are going to be winding yarn like this all the time. So first let's look at the inexpensive version. This yarn winder and this yarn Swift are from Amazon, and they are pretty inexpensive. Both of these are under $20 each. It depends on which listing you purchase, basically. But they have some of these that are under $20 from different sellers, and they have these under $20 from different sellers. So essentially what happens with a yarn winder is that this thing right here clamps to the edge of your table. Then you have a yarn guide where you loop the yarn through here, and it feeds it into the right spot on the winder. And then you turn the handle and it turns very quickly and pulls yarn from wherever you're pulling it from and winds it into a cake of yarn, which is a center pole cake, and that can be really handy, especially if you prefer not having your hand wound ball of yarn rolling all over the place or having to use a yarn bowl so that it doesn't roll. But a center pole cake of yarn can be used in a yarn bowl, or it can just sit on the floor or on the table by itself because it's flat on the bottom. So as you can see, this one can wind pretty quickly, and this is the less expensive version. The main downside to this one is that, in my personal opinion, this flat area around the center part where it makes the hole in the middle of the skein is a little small. It could be bigger, and that would help it hold a little bit more yarn a little easier. And the other flaw with this particular model is that this thing right here, it falls over real easy, and it doesn't stay out in the locked position very well. So you do have to kind of hold it with your finger as you're winding, and of course this would be clamped to the edge of the table, but you have to kind of hold it still to keep it from just going like that and falling over. But if you are only going to be winding yarn every now and then this is a great choice because it is inexpensive, and you don't want to end up getting a really expensive one if you're only going to be winding yarn once a month or whatever. So here is the inexpensive yarn Swift, and this one also does what it says it's supposed to do. Is it super incredible quality? No, but if you're only winding every once in a while, you don't need it to be some kind of amazing quality product, because I've had this one for a couple years now, and I have wound dozens of skeins on it over that time. And aside from it just being very lightweight and a little bit flimsy, I've never had any problems with it like breaking or causing any issues for the yarn. So, like I said, if you're only going to be winding yarn every now and then, this is also a good option because it is not very expensive and it will last quite a while if you are only planning to do, a few skeins per month or something like that. So this one has this little screw right here where you can loosen it and take this like shaft out of this hole, and then you put the shaft in the hole and tighten the screw when you're ready to use it. Then you can again clamp it to the table. Now this particular model does not have any kind of cushioning in the clamp. I highly recommend you get one that does if you're going to order one of these, because this one came with a kind of like a sharp part on the metal right here that does not just break off easy, and this will tear up, it will scratch up whatever table you clamp it to. So if yours has a flaw like that, make sure you please put something in between. I usually put like a piece of felt or some kind of soft fabric, couple layers thick, in between the clamp and my table. But even though this one is not perfect, it's not like the best possible choice for winding yarn, it still does what it needs to do, and it winds the yarn just fine. So once you've clamped this to the end of the table, this is called an umbrella swift, by the way. You're going to take this little clamp thing. It doesn't really want to do it sideways, but I'm going to do it standing up and then lay it down. So you lift this thing right here as you pinch it, and that opens up the swift like an umbrella. And then we can put the untwisted hank of yarn around that, and then this will spin to allow the yarn to wind off of it. So this is a great choice, like I said, if you're not going to be winding yarn all the time, but you just want to have that for when you do need it, because it does work just fine. There's nothing wrong with this setup. But if you do want to wind a lot of yarn, or if you just would rather have a nicer product to start with, then you could go for one of these type of swifts. I think this one is Birch, and this one is from Knit Picks or We Crochet. And this one is made out of, instead of these little rubber tube things for the holding the yarn, this one has basically giant, thick popsicle sticks that are tied together at the end so that it can open and close easily. So this one has a nice heavy wooden clamp section at the bottom, and then this part, this area right here, is where you slide it over the table, and then there's a screw here with a padded end where that you can unscrew it and then tighten it against your table. I still prefer to put some kind of fabric or whatever in between there just to cushion it and make sure that it doesn't scratch or anything with my table, but this one is not as likely to scratch because it is not raw metal. It is padded on the end of the screw. So then on this model, it also has a screw right here that you can loosen up and lift the umbrella part of it, and of course this part comes up with it. It just doesn't want to do it because I'm doing it sideways. But this whole thing can lift up and down, and again you can wrap the twisted or untwisted hank of yarn onto the umbrella area, and then that will spin to allow the yarn to come off of it freely. And then I also have over here the Knit Picks yarn winder. And this one is still plastic, just like the other one. I do feel that this one is a bit nicer. And this one actually doesn't cost that much more than the cheapest one you can get on Amazon. This one is also available on Amazon, but I just prefer to get things straight from Knit Picks. Now this one has a longer section in the middle to make sure that it can hold enough yarn. And it also has a bigger area down here at the bottom, and a nice smooth edge around the edge here. And then this one, of course, also has a handle and a yarn guide, but this yarn guide actually stays put. So this one, you have to kind of lift it as far as when it's upside down. You just have to kind of lift it to kind of get it out of this little notch right there. But when you open it up, it clicks into that notch and it does not fall down, which is pretty handy because then you don't have to use your thumb to hold it. So if I were to just close this right here and turn this back over, again, you would clamp this to the table. The clamp is right here. Then you would engage the yarn guide, and you would turn according to the arrow right here, and it would wind the yarn very quickly. Now, of course, it would stay still if it was clamped to your table, but I'm just holding it right now. So to clamp this one to the table, you turn it over, and there is a clamp right here. This little screw thing adjusts the clamp, and this part goes underneath the table. And if you look right here, what I would do, I'm going to need more than 2 hands for this, but you take out this little clear capped screw, and the clear part is what helps you turn it with your fingers. So you take that out, and then you insert this little rod right here into this hole. So right below the handle is a hole. You put that in there, and then you can take the screw and screw it back into the same hole that it was in already. And once you get that screwed in and you tighten it down, now the clamp cannot come loose while you're winding it. Now this one also has some small rubber feet on the bottom as well, right there, to help it grip the table better. And of course there's rubber right here on the padded clamp. And you put this over your table, and then you would tighten the screw to secure it to the table. Alright, so those are basically the 2 types of setups that you can use to wind yarn. If you're just going to get a yarn winder and you don't need a Swift, I would go ahead and recommend the Knit Picks winder because it's only a few dollars more than the most inexpensive kind you can get on Amazon. And I do think this one is a nicer winder. But again, if you want to go with the slightly less expensive version, it works just fine too. So if you're on a budget, don't worry about getting this one. If you just want to get the most inexpensive option possible, there's nothing wrong with this choice. There's a couple things that you might have to kind of work around slightly, like holding the yarn guide still while you're winding, but that's really not the end of the world. It's not that big of a deal. So either one of these winders is a great choice, but I do prefer this one over the slightly less expensive version. Both of these Swifts work just fine. They wind the yarn just like they're supposed to. They hold the yarn and hold the hank open so that you can pull off of it very quickly. So both of these winders function just fine. It's just a question of whether you're going for a budget choice or a longer lasting, higher quality choice. But again, I've had this one for several years and I've never had anything on it break. So this one may last for quite a while, even though it is a very inexpensive option. And one more thing I should also mention here is that even if you never buy yarn in a hank like this, if you ever have partially used skeins of yarn left over, no matter what type of setup they originally came in, whether it was a center pole skein or a hand wound ball or whatever, regardless, if you ever have partially used skeins of yarn left over after a project, you know how they kind of are like empty and floppy and saggy and they get tangled up real easy? You don't have to mess with that anymore if you just have a yarn winder. You don't even have to have the Swift for that. But if you just have a yarn winder, you can take, for example, the center pole end of a half-used skein and wind it into a small cake, and it just keeps it from getting tangled in your stash a lot better. So even if you never use yarn in a hank, like I mentioned, a yarn winder, one of these, is a great option if you have a lot of those partially used skeins because it really helps tidy them up. All right, so now that we've gone over the different types of winders and swifts, I'm going to demonstrate how to use a winder and swift. And I'm going to go ahead and show you on the Knit Picks winder and swift, but the process is basically the same for these two as well. So I'm going to set up to wind some yarn, and then I'll show you how we're going to do that. All right, so once you've got your yarn winder and your swift clamped to the edge of your table, you're going to take that skein of yarn, and if you notice, it looks like it's made of basically two big twists on either side that are twisted together. You're going to need to separate those. So you can either take the little bump of yarn that is pushed through the end of the skein and push it out the back, or you can just take the two sides of the skein in each hand and pull them apart. And once this comes undone, you're basically going to have a long loop of yarn that has kind of been flattened together. So to separate the two sides of the loop, you're going to want to find the little openings in the ends of the hank and stick your fingers in there and separate the hank so that it is basically just one long loop of yarn. Now you'll want to have your umbrella swift partly open but not open all the way, because it is a little bit easier to get the hank of yarn onto the swift when it's not open all the way. So I like to have it just partly open. And then you're going to take the big loop of yarn that you have and you're going to put it around the middle of the swift like so. And once you've got that hank on the swift, you'll want to adjust the swift by opening the umbrella portion a little bit more, just to make sure that it is securely holding the hank of yarn fairly taut. You don't want it to be really tight, but you don't want it to be like sagging either. Now, as you put this on the swift, you're also going to need to untwist it and make sure that the loop of yarn is basically laying flat up against the swift and it's not twisted on itself. Because if it is twisted, it will be much harder to pull yarn from it smoothly. So hanks of yarn have little lengths of extra yarn that are tied around the big giant loop to keep it from getting separated and getting tangled as you unwind it. So you're going to need to either cut or untie those little strands of yarn that are holding the hank together. Now, one of these little tied strands will also have the two ends of the yarn tied with it. So you can either untie them or cut the knots off. I just prefer to cut it right below the knot because it's just a lot faster and you're only saving like an inch of yarn from each end by untying it by hand. So once you have the little ties cut or untied and removed, then you need to find the two ends of the yarn that you're going to be winding, and the one that you're going to wind from needs to be the one that is on the outside. So kind of pull on each one a little bit and see which one is coming from the outside of the hank. And the one that comes from the outside is the one that you're going to then pull on and feed it to your yarn winder. So when you come over to your yarn winder, you're going to take the end of yarn and you're going to feed it through the little metal yarn guide. So you're just going to bring it around through the hole until it's coming out the hole on the other side. And then on the top of the yarn winder, on the place where the skein sits, it will have a little notched section where that you can lay the end of the yarn across the top of the part of the winder that holds the skein. So once you have the end of the yarn securely wedged down into that notch, then you can start turning the handle of the winder. You want to make sure that you're turning it in the correct direction. So for example, the Knit Picks winder has an arrow on it that shows you which way to turn the handle. And as you're turning, you may prefer to just let the yarn feed right off the swift, or you may prefer to use your hand to help guide the yarn off of the swift, because sometimes even if you make your hank lay what appears to be flat around the swift, it can still have some twist in it that you can't see in some of the strands that you're pulling off of the swift. So it may be that you need to use your hand just to help guide the yarn off of the swift, But either way, you're just going to continue winding the handle on the yarn winder until all of that yarn is on the winder. Now, once you get down to almost the end of your hank, you should only have like a few wraps of yarn left on the Swift. You're going to want to start slowing down, and this is when you do definitely want to put your hand on the yarn as it's feeding the yarn winder, even if you weren't already doing that before, because as this slows down, you're going to have a hold of the end of the yarn to make sure that it doesn't just go flying off and end up coming loose from the Swift and winding into the winder too loosely. So I like to just put my hand on the yarn as it feeds down into the winder towards the last few wraps on the Swift. And as you get to the end and you're slowing down, you will eventually get the tail in your hand. And just bring the tail up as it pulls the tail into the winder, and you're either going to tuck the tail into the top of the skein or into the bottom. So I like to kind of push my thumbs onto the center part of the winder that holds the skein and press down with my thumbs as I lift the skein up off of that kind of cone. It's not really a cone shaped, but off of that section in the middle. And like I said, you'll either want to tuck the outside end of the skein, into the hole on the top of the skein or into the hole on the bottom. And the final step that I like to do is to just give that skein or cake of yarn a good squeeze around the middle to kind of close up the hole that's in the middle, and that helps secure the end so that it doesn't just fall out real easily. And that also just helps make the cake pull more evenly as you start to use it. So here's a quick time lapse of me winding the second skein. And I just wanted to mention here that if you were to wind a half-used skein of yarn into a smaller skein to keep it from getting tangly, as I mentioned earlier, then you wouldn't even need the Swift. All you would do is take the center pole end of that half-used skein and feed it into the yarn winder just like you would if you were winding yarn off of the Swift, and use the winder to pull the yarn from the center of the skein and wind it into a much smaller cake that will be much more tidy in your stash. So each 100-gram center pole skein took about 5 minutes to wind, and that is such a time savings over winding it by hand. So if you plan on winding hank yarn often, or if you have a lot of those half-used skeins, I really hope you'll give a Yarn Swift and winder a try, because it can really help save a lot of time and frustration. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know if you have ever used a yarn winder in Swift in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.